Hello, and welcome to the RRAG Risk Analysis Group webinar. In the past year, the question for boards has shifted from are we using AI to can we defend how we're using it? That shift is where today's session lives. I'm MK Palmore, founder and principal advisor at Apogee Global RMS, and thank you for joining us for this second installment of the RRAG Risk Analysis Group webinar series. Today's conversation is about a new class of executive liability, one that most governance models were never designed to address. In our first session, we introduced the nexus of risk framework, the idea that cyber, physical, and human capital risk are not separate disciplines, but causally connected obligations. Today, you're going to see the framework in action. We're going to watch technology risk become legal risk and legal risk become leadership risk in real time. Guiding that conversation with me is Gail Gottehrer, Esquire, one of the most respected voices in technology law and AI governance. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to walk through the emerging liability landscape, the governance gap most organizations have not yet seen, and a practical checklist your board can begin acting on within the next 90 days. So let's get to it. It's my pleasure to introduce Gail Gottehrer, an advisor to Apogee Global RMS, where she helps the firm deliver a unified risk management approach that integrates cyber and physical security, organizational resilience, and leadership development for businesses navigating the risk of AI and emerging technologies. Gail is a senior legal and technology executive who works at the intersection of law, technology, and business strategy. She advises global companies, boards, regulators, and policymakers on AI governance, cybersecurity, data privacy, and enterprise risk, and is the founder of Gail Gottehrer Consulting, LLC. Most recently, she served as vice president overseeing global litigation, IT, labor, employment, and government relations for a $4 billion plus New York Stock Exchange listed company with a workforce of more than 40,000 people. Before going in-house, she founded and led emerging technologies practices, both independently and at a national law firm. Over her career, Gail has directed global ransomware response, defeated a $300 million plus class action for a Fortune 500 insurer after a jury trial, and established enterprise governance for AI and emerging technologies. She holds a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and certifications in AI and evolving technologies from MIT, Kellogg, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Gail to our webinar series. Welcome. How are you doing today, Gail?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you because it is our observation, and certainly that of yours and others, that the risk landscape is changing under our feet. It is evolving, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence, and we believe that organizations are, quite frankly, struggling to figure out what their footing is as it relates to the adoption of this new technology, and governance, the liability associated with it are topics that we're going to cover here today. So welcome to the webinar, and again, looking forward to this conversation with you. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the emerging liability landscape, offer some questions for your organization to be asking internally. We're going to talk about closing the gap as it relates to governance, and we're going to provide you with a practical checklist that you can then take internally into your organizations and make a determination as to whether or not you're taking the appropriate steps to protect and adopt and securely manage artificial intelligence in your organizations. Gail, one of the topics here to get us off is just about the liability landscape and how that's been changing as it relates to AI. I was hoping you might offer your thoughts on what that looks like, and that will help us get this conversation off the ground.
Absolutely. And I think you have the key word up there, which is emerging. If folks are looking for clarity here, I'm sorry to disappoint, but there is none. So this is changing and evolving before our eyes. So it's very important to listen to conversations like the ones we're having today, ask questions, don't take things for granted, because it's well understood that technology evolves much more quickly than regulation or law or court decisions, which are by necessity reactive. So this is where companies and boards really need to be focusing. So, for example, the regulatory environment, very different globally. So the EU, who has been a leader in privacy with the GDPR, the same with AI. So we have the EU AI Act. It's a risk-based approach for AI developers and deployers about specific uses of AI. So different than what we're seeing in the US, it outright prohibits certain uses of AI that are deemed as socially unacceptable, threats that are too high to people's safety, security, human rights. So that's one category. Then there are obligations around what they deem to be high-risk AI systems before those can be put on the market. And those are things that the good news, to the extent there is, okay, we're comfortable with that from the cyber world. Things like risk assessments, which we've done for years. Things like knowing what data you have, making sure it's high quality, making sure you've eliminated bias, or to the extent you can't debias your data, don't use it. Things like logging and traceability of your results, and also human oversight. So definitely similarities to things that we have a lot of experience with in dealing with cyber risk, but definitely an evolution with AI. So once we leave the EU and come back to the US, very similar to what we see with privacy in the US. Much talk about federal legislation, but we have not seen it. The controversial topic there in a lot of these conversations is preemption. The idea that federal law should control AI regulation as opposed to having state-by-state decisions and laws. There are strong arguments on both sides. We're nowhere close to a resolution, which defaults us into state-by-state analysis. And just one state that I wanted to highlight because it's a very recent development, the Colorado AI Act had a lot of talk around it. It was a big implementation that was coming up. It was talking about a duty of care that developers and deployers were going to have to protect individuals from algorithmic discrimination. So this was much fanfare. We were waiting to see how this was going to roll out. How it rolled out was that it didn't roll out. So there's been a replacement. It's been replaced by Senate Bill 189, which eliminates that duty of care in favor of a more business-friendly, more disclosure-based framework. So again, that focuses on automated decision-making technologies that are used to materially influence a consequential decision. So apologies, that's very legalese. So what that means essentially is if the AI system is being used to determine who gets a job, who gets a mortgage, who gets ability to get government housing or other government benefits, which we've seen cases about discrimination in those areas, that would qualify as those kinds of consequential decisions. And that's now the focus of the Colorado AI Act. And so not to leave out our friends in regulatory agencies, the SEC, again, no AI specific rules yet, but the cyber disclosure rules are broad enough to encompass AI because as we see and as we understand, AI is just amplifying cyber risks and the need for governance. So that's where you're going to see, and we've already seen the SEC getting involved. So an example there is under the cyber rules, publicly traded companies have to disclose material cyber incidents on a Form 8K within 4 business days of determining that it's material. So that would include AI-related risks, and we're starting to see those as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's a patchwork within the United States, and as you get outside of the US, even more so.
You made a comment at the top of talking about the regulatory environment that I think is important to extend on, and that is the idea that regulations almost always lag behind, and then sometimes very in an elongated fashion, lag behind technology developments. Any comment on how we've seen that sort of repeat itself over time, and then whether or not we should expect in any fashion for the landscape to level out at any one point in time?
So an example, just in my career, how I've seen it is that I've been involved in the autonomous vehicle research, development, and deployment space for about 15 years before anybody was really focused on that as a use of physical AI. And there was a lot of talk about how there was going to be regulation at the federal level. There were a variety of state laws. And really what happened was that we had technology from some of the large Silicon Valley companies already ready to go on the road, right? Being tested. There was talk about one company rolling out a vehicle that had no steering wheel and no pedals. It was going to be completely technology driven or operated. Driven is the wrong word there. Back in the day, I was advising companies on that because the life cycle to build a vehicle is 5 to 6 years. So you're making your R&D decisions, which are expensive decisions, way before you know what the law is going to be. And ambiguity is a problem because, for example, that vehicle was ready to go. The technology would work, put aside safety demonstration, but the operation could happen. But the real question was, will that be street legal anywhere? And if it's legal in one state, vehicles cross state lines. So are you going to invest in something that might be legal in one state, but not another? How are you going to sell that? And that's a case where, well, many of us are concerned about regulation because sometimes regulators don't understand the technology. It's just not what their bread and butter is. Regulation gives you certainty. At least whether you like the regulation or not, you know what the rules of the road are, no pun intended. But we didn't have that. So we were kind of making educated guesses. And that was a lot of what I did then and continue to do is really embracing that ambiguity and that gray zone, giving your best bet and doing the what ifs, and then ensuring around what you can and mitigating your own risk in-house as much as you can as well. So again, while I'd love to be really optimistic about seeing the law and regulation catch up, I don't think we're going to see it. I think, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, insurance may be what drives a lot of this evolution because the risks here are so significant. Whether or not you can insure them, I think is going to drive compliance, is going to drive governance. What you have to do to get insurance is going to lead to internal governance focus. And I think that and lawsuits, for better or worse, I think are going to drive clarity more than legislation or regulation in the short term.
Yeah, outstanding analogy, I think, that you brought up, and one that's inclusive, actually, of the AI technology. It's a good point to emphasize that AI technology has actually been in development for many, many years. And the autonomous vehicle scenario that you just outlined, I think, is a perfect example of how that's evolved, certainly much faster than regulation. And now, if I don't know about you guys, but here on the West Coast, we see a prolific use of autonomous vehicles in particular regions. If you go to San Francisco Bay Area, if you go down to Los Angeles, you see autonomous vehicles on the road being heavily utilized. I think that's a sign of the future. And the point to take away from what you just described so eloquently was the idea that you need help navigating and projecting where this will all be and how you can plan from a strategic standpoint to develop your posture on these items, taking into account examples of how things have transpired in the past. So the issue of liability, I think, to officers and within companies, within the enterprise structure, certainly comes up. How do you see this evolving, and have you seen impact already in terms of failures happening within the enterprise for the duty of care responsibility that we have as officials and organizations?
Absolutely. So a couple of publicly reported cases. There was one in Canada. It's called Moffat versus Air Canada. Folks may have heard of that. This was where a chatbot gave an individual incorrect information about booking a bereavement flight. So a lot of airlines, if you have to go to a funeral, you have a loss in your family, they'll give you a discount. So this person went on the Air Canada site and asked their chatbot, what do I have to do to get this discount? The chatbot gave him incorrect information. And then when it was discovered, Air Canada did not want to refund him his money and claimed that the correct information was available on the website, implying that he should have cross-referenced it. And so he sued for negligent misrepresentation, saying essentially the chatbot is the same as your website. You shouldn't have internal inconsistencies. And the Canadian tribunal held Air Canada was liable and that it was negligent for not taking reasonable care to ensure that the chatbot provided accurate information. So really not that surprising. This goes to the question we hear a lot. Do we need new laws or legal concepts to deal with AI? I think this is an example about just how negligent misrepresentation and accuracy on what you put on the internet kind of applies. So this one I don't think was surprising, but it's a clear finding of liability in the case of the chatbot. Similar things we've seen, SEC has been bringing proceedings for what they call AI washing, which is similar to what we saw in cyber as well. The allegation that people are making materially false and misleading statements about their purported use of AI or what their AI can do. And we've seen this a lot, right? Everybody wants to be the first mover. Everyone wants to describe themselves as being more cutting edge than their competition. So there are all these disclosures out there that do move the investing public, do move the market, and arguably that's what they're intended to do. So in these cases, the SEC brought two that settled with two investment advisors, one called Delphia, one called Global Predictions, and found that their statements about how they were using AI misled the public, and they settled for $400,000. So these are a sign, and we've seen since, I'm not aware of more settlements, but definitely more of these AI washing cases, which we're going to see more of. And this is something that boards need to think about because it's a question of, are you making adequate representations, right? This is the SEC who's now looking at you with a fine-tooth comb about what you're disclosing, if you're reviewing your disclosures, if you're misleading investors. So that's something really that we're going to see more of that's important to focus on. And one more SEC point that I wanted to mention, May 11, we saw the first shadow AI related 8K disclosure that I'm aware of. So just going again back to cyber, public companies have an obligation if there's a material incident, and material is a legalese term, but generally means something significant that the investors would consider relevant in making an investment decision. So if you become aware of a material cyber incident, you have to disclose it by filing a Form 8K with the SEC within 4 business days of determining that it's material. So in this case, on May 11, the company called CB Financial Services disclosed that a bank that was a wholly owned subsidiary had a material incident due to shadow AI, which it disclosed as, quote, an unauthorized AI-based software application. And they noted that it had not affected the bank's operations, but they were disclosing it because they viewed it as material because of the volume and the sensitive nature of the customer data that was leaked, then disclosed, which include bank customers' names, social security numbers, and dates of birth. So this is another very interesting trend that we're going to see more of, unfortunately, because shadow AI, which similar to shadow IT, which we've dealt with a lot on the cyber side, is when people are using AI that the company has not approved. They're not enterprise-wide deployments. They're, for example, someone opens ChatGPT on their phone and says, what do you think about this? And puts in potentially customer information, other sensitive information. uses an app that might be free at the App Store that has no cybersecurity protections, and this causes huge cyber risk. So the statistics on shadow AI continuing now are staggering. That's a whole different conversation we could have. But this is seeing shadow AI being significant enough to lead to a material incident that has to be disclosed to the SEC. So this has huge implications for boards, board governance. And I think this is an emerging trend that definitely needs focus.
So two questions pop up for me as you discuss that. I suspect that if we haven't already seen them, we're going to start to see very prevalent legalese in terms of contracts and things, like the language in contracts associated with disclosing the use of AI and what that will mean through that disclosure. Are we already seeing that in legal contracts, or is that one of these things that we should expect to see on the horizon?
I think it's one of those things that we're not seeing in an adequate way. I think folks are starting to pay attention, and I think there may be assumptions that certain things are sufficient, but this goes again to the pace of technology, right? You have to keep up with developments because your contractual requirement might have been adequate before the speed and the scope of AI really kicked in. So it's something that people really have to look at, because if you're going to, again, this reasonable care standard that we were talking about, what reasonable is when we come to technology changes by the day, right? What was reasonable last week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, before we saw certain kinds of incidents or were aware of certain capacity of technologies or ability to have fully automated attacks or increase in malware or ransomware attacks. Before those developments came out, something might have looked reasonable, but it's not now. So the question of, did you take reasonable action? Was your governance reasonable? Really is a time-specific question. And as the technology that we're deploying changes, we have to keep saying, is what I had yesterday reasonable today? And that's really a concern I'm seeing, that we're deploying more quickly than we're governing. And that's the struggle, right? Keeping up. Have you just rolled out some new app? Have you really vetted it? Have you really vetted that vendor, right? Has that vendor had an incident recently that should make you reevaluate your contract with them? And it's very complicated, but I think that's going to be the difference between organizations that can show reasonable governance, boards that can show reasonable and sufficient oversight, and ones that are unfortunately going to become the test cases or the headlines that we hear about.
So in my second question actually revolves around the next point, is the evolution of the insurance markets and requirements associated with the use of AI. What have you seen already in this regard? And I can only imagine that, again, like the legal space, and I see them as interlocked, insurance and the legal space. How do you see this evolving, and what have you already seen that should give us, at the very least, pause on how we navigate this terrain?
Yeah, this is a rapidly evolving industry as well. And it is very tied to legal, because when we do legal analyses, many times we have to share with clients that there's no way to eliminate risk. It's just how you manage it. And that's cyber risk, any kind of risk, buying another company, operating in certain markets. So once you can't eliminate risk, it's what can you insure for? And if you can't insure for certain things or adequately insure, can you afford to take the risk, take the hit with that insurance? And that really has to impact your business model and your risk tolerance. So what we've seen in the insurance space is, I think, comparable to what we saw at the beginning with cyber as well, is that the industry's concerned that there isn't enough data to really, it's an underwriting challenge, right? How big could these breaches be? How much could the damage be? How much should the premiums be? Because from everything we've seen, the scope and the scale of how these technologies are being deployed. I read an article recently about how most companies have at least some operational resources running on some form of AI or agentic AI, which means if something goes wrong, that could potentially take down your business, and the business interruption or the business losses, the downstream impact could be just staggering amounts. So what we're starting to see already is some of the names that you'd know in the insurance space, the big names, are excluding certain coverage, either by changing definitions or reading AI out of certain definitions in existing policies. Also by putting caps or sublimit on how much they will cover for AI-related liability. And also the kind of the good and the bad again is that we're starting to see a new industry emerge. So we're starting to see new market entrants, not the names that you would know in insurance, coming out with specific AI-specific coverage. And I think that's very interesting to see. These are smaller startups, other companies that are definitely focused. They're all in on AI. And I think, again, kind of a good thing, bad thing is that sort of, again, like we saw with cyber, right? To get cyber insurance, you had to have a lot of basic procedures and policies in place to qualify, which I think a lot of us were surprised certain companies didn't have. But the impetus to put those in place was being able to qualify for cyber insurance. I think you're going to see that now with this AI insurance, because a lot of these new companies are AI companies. They understand the technology. They're on the cutting edge, and they're going to ask you questions about what is in place in your organization. What governance do you have around it? What risk assessment did you do? Which we would hope, and we try to help companies do that before they deploy. But if you've done it before that, either because of pressure to keep up with other organizations or board pressure, now you're going to have to get your house in order a little more if you want to qualify for AI insurance, because these folks know the questions to ask. So again, I think insurance is really going to drive compliance and improvements. And this is where I would focus because, the old adage, if you can't insure it, you can't do it, right? The risk is just too big. Companies always ask me, oh, we'll just self-insure. And I'm like, if the big names won't insure you, you can't self-insure on that. So I think new conversations with the board, because boards assume that their traditional D&O is going to cover this. That might not be the case. So duty of oversight, fiduciary duties, definitely something you want to have a conversation with your insurance broker.
So part of the challenge that I see when we engage with clients is whether or not they're taking the necessary steps in terms of their strategic planning. And you see here on the screen whether or not we're asking folks around what they're doing around AI governance. Are they doing and providing the necessary frameworks? Are they reviewing this information with their board? Are they taking the necessary steps? From your vantage point, what questions should organizations be grappling with internally as they think about AI adoption, and what kinds of things? Where do those questions reside? Who's responsible for answering them? How should organizations be thinking about this?
So I think this is another example, similar to, again, what we've seen in cyber, is that we need to break down silos, right? This can't be any one person's responsibility or obligation. It's just not going to work just because of the nature of the technology. Sort of going to that shadow AI example I gave, that you can have formal AI governance in place, but and legal can write you a beautiful policy. We do that all the time. But if you have a policy and you don't have boots on the ground executing it, you become your worst enemy, because you have a policy which then will be held against you because you didn't implement it. And regulators love to find that. Juries love to find that. So you need that. You need HR, you need managers involved to help you with the shadow AI example. A good example is, right, these North Korean IT workers that we've seen, which is a huge problem, right? These fake IT workers. That is a perfect example of where That's not just an HR problem with onboarding being insufficient or thinking they've done their job doing a traditional onboarding like you would do for an admin or a lawyer, or IT doing the interview and concluding that the person had the right IT credentials. That's how these people are sneaking in to really sophisticated companies. This is where you need your whole offensive line out there. To use a sports analogy, everybody's got to be blocking and tackling, because if there's any gap, your risk increases. So I think this is an example. Another good example, there's procurement, right? Procurement, they're people who are used to buying pads and pencils or buying equipment for your warehouse. Now they're the ones potentially signing off on IT and AI purchases. That's a completely different skill set. And they should not be left alone to do this. I don't think they want to. I don't think they want to be evaluating those contracts, but in many cases they are. So we need to take a more holistic approach within the company. I think boards are going to get to the point where they're going to not only want to hear from the head of IT or the CISO, they're going to want to see, how is this something that really crosses across the whole organization? It needs to be horizontal, not vertical anymore, because it's just insufficient if you do it vertically. It's too much for one person to do properly.
I love how you describe that. And certainly your first example of the Korean IT workers is exactly the reason why we've taken the approach that we have at Apogee around what we call the nexus of risk. And it is because, as you described it, currently, even in large-scale enterprise, these risks exist in silos. Each domain is responsible for looking at these risks, and the exploitation exists in the seams where there's overlap, where there's the point where the cyber risk becomes physical, where cyber becomes an HR risk. Like, that is exactly where organizations need to be looking, because adversaries are always thinking about these gaps and how they can exploit them. So that
just one more quick, Tara. Yeah. That really goes to the conversations we've had about leadership, because that's hard to do, right? We talk about breaking down silos. That could lead to a really ugly turf war. That's really hard to do, right? People have their little fiefdoms. They do things well. They built, in some cases, their organizations. They're very attached to it. You need strong leadership to facilitate the kind of collaboration that's needed to address today's cyber risks and these emerging AI risks, which I see as just completely integrated. One amplifies the other. So it really is a leadership challenge. I think we can't stress that enough. We wish we could sell you a product that would make that all work, but that's not how this works. And it's only going to become more significant. We need strong, brave leadership to tell people this is going to be different, and this is the way it has to be.
You bring up an excellent point with the domains that folks are so protective over, their individual fiefdoms, their responsibilities, and how historically that overlap has not happened. And then, yes, it will require a top-down sort, not just a mandate, but really help everyone to understand that these risks are interrelated, that they all belong to one another, and the requirement then to have conversations, planning and otherwise, strategic and otherwise, and even down to some tactical considerations now occur in a horizontal fashion as opposed to a vertical fashion. That's the call to action. That's the mandate. And that's how folks need to be thinking about this world that we are not just entering, we're already there. I mean, this is happening in real time in your enterprise and organization. And if you aren't taking the steps to think about it, you're already behind the power curve, and likely increasing the chances of your organization being impacted by a significant risk-related event. So let's talk about closing this gap around governance. You've already touched upon where this risk lives. In other words, it lives across the enterprise and lives in very different aspects of it. But let's talk about, defensible things that you can be doing from the legal standpoint. You touched upon documented policies. I would add to that and you noted it. It's not enough just to have the documented policy. Have you walked through what that looks like in real time? Have you done tabletop exercises? Have you actually gone beyond the documentation to show that this is in fact the practice? But talk a little bit around closing down those gaps.
Sure. So this goes again to the concept we talked about what's reasonable. So what you have to show to a regulator or to a jury is not perfection, because again, like we know in the cyber world, you can't prevent things from happening, but you can prepare to reduce the risk, reduce the chances of becoming a victim, and be in the best position to recover quickly and minimize damage to people's data, to whatever your business operations are. So inventory and classification, people kind of shrug and think, of course, but again, it's hard. It's not, we take for granted people have it. We should not take for granted, because it again goes to shadow AI and these silos. If you're in finance, you may think you know every kind of AI finance is using, but depending on what your governance look like for approval, there may be people using other things. There may be other departments using things that you don't know about. So really having a complete inventory, when you do the exercise, I think you'll be surprised about what else is actually being used in your organization. From working with IT, I know every time I've done this with a company, IT looks at me and is like, what is that about? Who approved that? Did legal sign off on that? And I'm like, who created the workflow? Why am I not even on it? Right? So that's really an issue, and it's an exercise worth doing, and it's not a one and done. It has to be done repeatedly, because think about just all the AI that you're rolling out and how fast it's happening. Every time you're even doing the consideration, you need to update the inventory, update the risk profile and how one AI tool may impact another, look at that AI risk globally. And again, the incident response is another critical point. People, let's hope folks are doing better with incident response and tabletops. Those, I think, are incredibly valuable. I can't urge people to do those enough. But if you're rolling out or deploying AI, your incident response plan has to account for that. And what you should be tabletopping is AI-related scenarios, because as we've talked about, deployment of AI, use of AI creates cyber risk. For example, let's take that bank case with the 8K, right? Enough of a breach that leaked dates of birth, social security numbers, bank customers' names in a significant enough volume that within a short enough time, 4 or 5 days, they determined it was material enough to have to report to the SEC. Is that now was it accounted for in your incident response plan? Did you tabletop that? And if the answer is no, and it may be reasonable that you didn't think it could happen because shadow AI by definition you don't know about, it should be now, right? You now have to go back to that incident response plan, go back to your inventory and make sure your incident response plan accounts for every kind of AI risk associated with every AI tool you're running. And your next tabletop, which you should be doing pretty soon, should be relating to an AI type event. So I really urge people on that, because I think that's a gap that's just being missed. I think people view AI as some new business focused technology or marketing tool, and cyber is cyber, but it's all together. If you're going to deploy it, you have to protect it. So hand in hand, an AI rollout connects to your inventory, your incident response, your tabletop programs.
Good information. Let's close out your participation here, thinking about this from the aspect of the boards of directors, who I am certain are asking questions about AI. How do you see board responsibility changing in this new realm of technology development, and what kinds of things should they be thinking about, and what kinds of questions should they be asking?
So I think this is a challenge, right, for board members. We saw a lot when the SEC wanted to roll out rules about what kind of cyber qualifications board members had to have. There was a lot of pushback, and a lot of those requirements didn't go into place. I think it's a challenge already for boards to educate themselves sufficiently about cyber. So now when we're rolling out AI, and again, we've talked about the rapid pace, this is a challenge. I think what we're going to see is boards feeling more and more insecure, especially because of the insurance component that we talked about. And once you tell them that the D&O insurance is not a given, that nothing creates panic like that. But I think we're going to need boards. We're going to see boards asking more questions. And I think if you want to keep your board happy, businesses should be providing educational opportunities for boards so board members feel like they understand AI more. They understand how it's being used in the organization and in the industry, so they can have a better comfort level to ask better questions. And this is kind of a learning curve. We saw this again with cyber, where boards felt better asking intelligent questions. But there's always a question, what committee does it go into? A lot of times I've seen it be in risk. Sometimes it's in audit. Should it be a standalone AI committee? I think there's a real argument for that, and there's value to that. I think that depends on the nature of your business, right? How heavily regulated are you? What kind of data are you dealing with? If you have medical information, personalized information, social security, that kind of information, you're heavily regulated, highly sensitive data, maybe that's a stronger argument to put it in a specific risk category. Because again, going back to regulators, to bring this whole full circle, the jury and the regulator is going to ask, being aware of your risk profile, your people's DNA information, highly sensitive data, right? Medical data, you're a hospital. Did you take that seriously enough? Did you just lump it in risk with other things, or did you go above and beyond and show your focus and your concern by creating a specific company, a specific committee, as opposed to an example I used to like to use is like, are you selling ice cream, which is extremely important, not to, we all need ice cream. That's very important, but your risk profile is different, right? You may not need specific AI risk committee. You might be fine in the existing risk or audit, but no, so have to know where you fall on the spectrum, because how you're going to be evaluated is going to be based on your awareness of the risk that you pose. Same reporting cadence is very important. I think minimum quarterly, but more often than that is good, especially now with the uncertainty that we're talking about insurance, regulation, seeing these AI washing cases. I think over communicating to the board is good on those kinds of things now. And the same within the organization. I think you can't educate your employees enough. I like to think a lot of this shadow AI is not malicious. It's just lack of understanding. So the more education and training you can do, the better. And then finally, it has to be active oversight. You have to kick the tires. You have to say, with all due respect, C-suite, I know you're doing your best, but we need experts. I need somebody who specifically can answer my question about X. Or I know your pet project is rolling out this new AI tool, but based on what I've seen online, I'm concerned about that. I'm not saying no to you. I'm saying I need more. Let's learn more together. And it's going to be tense for a while, right? Because there's huge pressure on the C-suite to evolve and be a cutting edge company. But I think boards really have to say, what exactly is this? Have we asked all the right questions? Do we need to pump the brakes a little bit in order to get this right?
Outstanding. And with your depth of expertise, hopefully folks can see why we solicited and asked you to become part of our advisory board. Such detailed responses and great information that I hope folks will digest and then continue asking questions about.
Thank you. Yeah, I that is the takeaway I would tell people. This is something that's changing every minute. So it's not that you failed or you're not keeping up with somebody else. You'd be surprised about what the company next door is or is not doing, but reach out, ask for help. If you're doing a little bit better today than you were yesterday, you're succeeding. So I think asking questions, reaching out for resources, that's the way to go, because nobody's doing this perfectly. We're all adapting as it goes along day to day. So that's what we're here for.
Oh, let's make this actionable. Everything we've discussed today, the regulatory exposure, the duty of care, the governance gap, it all comes down to what you do when you leave this session. We're giving you 5 concrete actions you can take in the next 90 days. Start with an AI deployment inventory. You cannot govern what you don't know you have. Then assess the risk across the deployments, prioritizing high-risk systems first. Third, look at your insurance. Most organizations have meaningful gaps between their D&O, cyber policies, and their actual AI exposure. Find them before a regulator or plaintiff does. Fourth, and this is critical, brief your board, have conversations, document it. The documentation matters. And then finally, every registrant will receive the RRAG Risk Analysis Group AI Governance Checklist in the post-webinar follow-up. Use it. It's a structured starting point, not a checkbox exercise. The governance gap is real, but it is closable. These 5 steps are how you start closing it. I want to thank our guest, Gail Gottehrer. She's been an invaluable member to our advisory board. Thank you for the clarity that you bring to this work, and it's exactly what boards and officers need right now. And we are continually grateful that you shared it with us today, and we're continually grateful for your impact to our organization. To everyone watching, a few things before we close. If today's conversation surfaced a question you would like us to address directly, submit it through the post-event form. Your questions shape our written follow-up, and they will shape the future sessions in this particular series. You're also going to receive the AI governance checklist we previewed earlier. Use it, bring it to your next board meeting, use it as a baseline for your organization to determine where you guys stand today as it relates to AI adoption. A word about what we do at Apogee Global RMS. We are a practitioner-led enterprise risk management firm. We help boards and executive teams govern the risk that cross categories. The risks that do not fit neatly under cyber, under legal, or under operations, but live in the space between them. That's the work. And if today's session resonated, that is likely the work your organization needs. If you'd like to continue this conversation directly, feel free to reach out to us at information@apogeeglobalrms.com or on our website, book a consultation with myself or the other executive leaders of our firm. I want to give you some highlights. In our next session, we're going to feature our principal advisor, David McGurk, and another advisory board member, and we're excited to have this conversation with Lieutenant General Omar Jones, United States Army, retired, on the subject of leading in volatile times. Watch for the registration announcement for the 3rd in the series for the RRAG Risk Analysis Group, and for myself, for Gail Gottehrer, and for the team at Apogee Global. I want to thank you for giving us your time today. We'll see you guys out on the landscape and hopefully see you on our next webinar. Thank you.